We are taught to imagine the Middle Ages as a long interruption, a thousand-year pause between the sophistication of Rome and the brilliance of the Renaissance. An era defined by decay, crumbling roads, lost knowledge, illiteracy, superstition, and stagnation. Civilization, we're told, went dark. But this story depends on one assumption above all others: that the Middle Ages unfolded exactly as later historians described them. And that assumption deserves closer scrutiny. Because when we look beyond textbooks, into architecture, infrastructure, logistics, and chronology, something feels off. Not dramatically wrong, not obviously false, just incomplete. The Middle Ages are not documented the way Rome is, nor the way the early modern world is. Instead, they appear fragmented, discontinuous, reconstructed from copies of copies, written centuries after the events they claim to describe. Large stretches of time are defined less by contemporary records and more by retrospective narrative, which raises a quiet but unsettling question. What if the Middle Ages did happen, but not in the way we've been told? Or more precisely, what if the Middle Ages were redescribed to explain a world that already existed? Consider the physical evidence. Across Europe, massive stone structures appeared during or just after this so-called Dark Age. Cathedrals of impossible scale. Bridges spanning rivers with engineering precision that rivals Rome. Cities laid out with geometry, drainage, and infrastructure that would require advanced planning and sustained institutional knowledge. These were not crude constructions. They were not experimental. They were not tentative. They appear fully formed. And yet, we're told they emerged from societies that had largely forgotten mathematics, engineering, and centralized administration. This contradiction is usually resolved with a single word: continuity. We're told knowledge survived in monasteries, that monks preserved texts, that skills passed quietly from generation to generation. But continuity leaves traces. And in many places, those traces are strangely thin. There are long gaps in building records, sudden appearances of standardized architectural styles across vast regions, stonework techniques that emerge without clear developmental stages, technologies that seem to arrive already mature. The Middle Ages, as commonly described, ask us to believe that civilization simultaneously forgot and remembered how to build itself, that it collapsed, but somehow kept its measuring systems, that it lost literacy, yet coordinated massive construction projects across kingdoms. This doesn't prove deception, but it does suggest compression, a smoothing over of complexity. Now consider the timeline itself. The Middle Ages span roughly 1,000 years. Yet when historians divide them, early, high, late, the boundaries are fuzzy. Events bleed into one another. Dates shift depending on region. Entire centuries are defined more by absence than presence. And absence is not neutral. Absence is something that must be explained. In many cases, that explanation is chaos, invasion, decline, barbarism. But chaos, too, leaves evidence. Population collapse leaves ruins. Loss of expertise leaves crude replacements. Institutional failure leaves disorder. Yet much of medieval Europe shows the opposite: order, planning, uniformity. So another possibility emerges, not as a conclusion, but as a working hypothesis. What if the Middle Ages were not an age of collapse, but an age of inheritance? What if later societies found themselves surrounded by infrastructure they did not fully understand, and constructed a narrative to explain how they came to possess it? A narrative that framed the past not as advanced, but as primitive, because primitiveness justifies authority, and authority requires legitimacy. This is not an argument that the Middle Ages never happened. It's a question of how they happened, of whether the story we tell is descriptive or explanatory, and whether explanation, over time, became substitution. If that were the case, we would expect to see something very specific: evidence of a world that appears continuous in stone, but discontinuous in memory. And that is exactly where the next layer of this story begins. If the Middle Ages were an era of inheritance rather than collapse, the first thing we would expect to find is function without authorship. Systems still operating, structures still standing, cities still expanding, but with no clear record of who designed them or how. And this pattern appears again and again. Across Europe, medieval cities often follow layouts that predate their supposed founding. Roads align with older grids. Walls sit atop earlier foundations. Entire neighborhoods conform to geometries that make sense only if planned as a whole, yet no founding documents describe that planning. Instead, records describe maintenance, repairs, renovations, additions, conversions, very rarely creation. Cathedrals are a prime example. Official histories describe them as multi-century projects, built slowly by societies with limited resources and fragmented political authority. And yet, many exhibit a coherence of design that suggests unified vision. The proportions are consistent. The symbolism is integrated. Structural innovations appear simultaneously across regions. Flying buttresses do not gradually improve. They appear refined. Rib vaults do not stumble toward efficiency. They arrive optimized. This is not how technologies normally develop. Normally, we see failure, variation, abandoned experiments. But medieval architecture often skips the awkward phase. One explanation is guild secrecy, knowledge passed quietly among specialists. But secrecy still leaves debris, prototypes, regional quirks. Instead, we see standardization. And standardization implies precedent. Even more curious is how often medieval builders claim restoration rather than invention. Latin inscriptions speak of renewal, of bringing back former glory, of repairing what had fallen into disuse, not creating something new, but reasserting something old. Which leads to a deeper question. If knowledge survived the collapse of Rome, why was it framed as survival at all? Why emphasize loss rather than continuity? The answer may lie not in engineering, but in legitimacy. After Rome, power fractured. New authorities rose, kings, bishops, emperors, often without clear lineage. They inherited land, cities, and infrastructure that dwarfed their administrative capacity. To rule, they needed explanation. An explanation requires narrative. A story in which the present is superior to the past, in which the current order is not a steward of greatness, but a rebuilder from ruins. This reframing accomplishes something important. It lowers expectations. If the past was primitive, then the present, no matter how modest, becomes progress. But this reframing comes at a cost. It introduces a strange asymmetry in the historical record. We know names of kings, bishops, and wars in excruciating detail. Genealogies are preserved, titles recorded, borders argued over endlessly. Yet the people who designed aqueducts, laid out cities, and built stone vaults capable of standing for centuries remain anonymous. Civilization remembered who ruled, but forgot who built. That is not accidental. Rulers require continuity of authority. Builders require continuity of knowledge. And knowledge, unlike authority, can threaten legitimacy. So knowledge is minimized, simplified, mythologized. It becomes lost. Now consider literacy. We are told literacy declined sharply after Rome, that reading and writing were confined to monasteries, that the general population was largely illiterate. Yet medieval Europe produced an explosion of legal documents, land charters, trade records, ecclesiastical correspondence, and standardized contracts. Trade networks stretched across continents. Banking systems emerged. Universities formed. None of this functions in a society that has forgotten how to read. So what actually declined? Not literacy itself, but access to authorship. Writing became centralized, controlled, filtered through institutions, which means what survived was not necessarily representative, only authorized. This creates the illusion of a thin record, not because nothing happened, but because only certain things were allowed to be remembered. And that brings us to chronology. If the Middle Ages were compressed or reinterpreted, we would expect inconsistencies in dating, overlapping reigns, conflicting timelines, events that seem to repeat with different names. And in fact, medieval chronology is full of anomalies. Entire centuries are reconstructed retrospectively. Calendars shift. Chroniclers disagree not by years, but by generations. Some events appear simultaneously in different regions under different descriptions. Others vanish entirely. Historians often attribute this to poor record-keeping. But poor record-keeping does not produce coherent narratives. It produces chaos. The medieval timeline, however, is oddly smooth. Wars lead to reforms. Plagues lead to renaissances. Decline naturally precedes progress. It reads less like a record and more like a story. a story shaped after the fact, which raises a possibility that is uncomfortable but difficult to ignore. What if the Middle Ages, as a 1,000-year era, are not a direct memory, but a reconstruction designed to bridge a gap no one could fully explain? A way to make sense of inheritance without admitting origin. If that is true, then the most important evidence would not be texts. It would be stone, because stone does not rewrite itself. And when we examine the physical world left behind, bridges, foundations, underground works, we find a continuity that the written record struggles to account for. A civilization that appears stable, organized, and technically capable, yet strangely unnamed. Which means the question is no longer whether the Middle Ages happened, but whether they were experienced or assigned. And that question leads directly into the issue of scale, because the next thing that doesn't quite fit is how much was supposedly built by societies we're told were barely holding together. Scale is where the Middle Ages begin to strain credibility, not in isolation, but in accumulation. One cathedral can be explained. One bridge can be rationalized. One fortified city might be an exception, but thousands, spread across continents, aligned by proportion, orientation, and technique, that requires something more than perseverance. It requires systems. Medieval Europe is described as politically fragmented, economically strained, and technologically regressed. Authority was local. Resources were limited. Transportation was slow. Skilled labor was scarce. And yet, during this same period, Europe undertook one of the largest construction efforts in human history. Stone cathedrals weighing hundreds of thousands of tons. Road networks maintained across kingdoms. Ports engineered to withstand centuries of tidal pressure. Fortifications designed with geometric precision long before modern surveying tools. And these were not vanity projects. They were structural, load-bearing, integrated into cities that functioned for generations. This kind of building does not happen through improvisation. It requires surveying, standardized measurement, logistics, quarrying at scale, skilled coordination across time. Most importantly, it requires institutional memory. If each generation had to rediscover how to build, structures would degrade, techniques would fluctuate, quality would vary wildly. But medieval stonework is remarkably consistent. The same ratios appear across regions. The same construction logic repeats. The same errors are avoided, which suggests builders were not inventing methods, they were following them. This becomes even more apparent underground. Beneath many medieval cities are vaulted chambers, tunnels, drainage systems, and foundations that are older than the buildings above them, often far older. These underground works are typically more sophisticated than the surface structures they support. Better stone fitting, more advanced water management, greater longevity. And yet, medieval records rarely mention their construction. They are simply there, inherited, repurposed, renamed. Cities expand upward while resting on a substrate they did not author. This is not unusual in ancient cities, but it becomes problematic when the supposed builders of the surface structures are claimed to be the same ones who lost all previous knowledge. Why would a society that had forgotten Roman engineering routinely build on top of Roman or pre-Roman foundations without documenting their methods? The more plausible explanation is that they never forgot. They simply did not originate. Now consider time. Cathedrals are often described as taking hundreds of years to build. This explanation is meant to account for their scale and complexity, but it introduces another problem. A project spanning centuries requires uninterrupted continuity, political, economic, and technical. Wars cannot erase knowledge. Plagues cannot disrupt skill transmission. Administrations must persist. Funding must survive regime change. Yet the Middle Ages are defined by disruption, invasions, famines, collapses, resets, and still, the projects continue. Not restarted, continued, which suggests the builders were not dependent on fragile, ad hoc systems, but on something more resilient, something inherited, something already standing. In many cases, evidence suggests cathedrals were not built from scratch, but expanded, enclosed, or reworked from earlier structures. Walls thickened, roofs raised, facades added. The core remains. If so, the narrative shifts. Instead of medieval societies constructing miracles from nothing, they may have been adapting monuments they did not fully understand. This reframing explains something else that often goes unaddressed. why medieval art and symbolism appear simultaneously sophisticated and imitative. Icons repeat across regions. Motifs recur with little variation. Symbolic systems appear complete, yet their meanings are often unclear even to later commentators. Symbols outlast understanding. They are inherited alongside structures, used because they are already there. Now return to the idea of the Dark Ages. Darkness implies absence. But what if darkness here refers not to lack of activity, but lack of authorship? A period where people lived inside systems whose origins were no longer accessible, where memory had fractured, but function remained, where history became less about recording reality and more about explaining possession. This would also explain the sudden rebirth of knowledge during the Renaissance. Not a rediscovery, but a reframing. A moment when scholars stopped asking who built the world and instead claimed it. By translating, cataloging, renaming. By assigning origin where inheritance had been uncomfortable. Which brings us to a final, critical issue. If the Middle Ages were shaped as a narrative to explain a world already built, then the most important question is not what happened during them, but what happened before them, and why that memory was so thoroughly obscured. Because to erase origin, you first have to survive it. If the Middle Ages unfolded differently than we've been told, the most revealing detail is not what's missing, but what remains. Stone endures. Layouts persist. Foundations continue to carry the weight of cities that have changed names, flags, and rulers dozens of times. The physical world suggests continuity where the written record describes rupture. And that tension matters, because history is not merely a catalog of events. It is a framework for legitimacy. It explains who belongs, who rules, and who has the right to define progress. A dark age serves a purpose. It lowers the past so the present can rise. It transforms inheritance into achievement. It replaces stewardship with ownership. This does not require conspiracy. It requires structure. When institutions inherit systems they cannot fully explain, they simplify. They compress. They narrate. They fill gaps not with lies, but with coherence. And coherence, repeated long enough, becomes truth. The Middle Ages, as we describe them, may be less a lived experience and more a bridge, constructed after the fact, to connect a fractured memory to a confident present. That does not mean medieval people were ignorant, passive, or incapable. On the contrary, they adapted, they maintained, they preserved what functioned even when meaning was lost. They lived inside a world older than their stories. And perhaps that is the real lesson. Not that civilization fell and rose again, but that it continued quietly while its origins slipped beyond recall. If that is true, then the question is no longer whether the Middle Ages happened as described. The question becomes, what other eras are we mistaking for beginnings, when they may simply be moments of renaming? And what happens when we stop asking who ruled the past and start asking who built it? Because once you ask that question, history stops feeling settled and starts feeling inherited.